Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow Diep and little Nye as they journey through heavy rain to visit Mrs. Huyen, James's mother. What starts as a simple trip to deliver corn turns into an emotional evening filled with warmth and gratitude when Diep surprises Mrs. Huyen with an unexpected gift worth $20,000. But beyond the price tag lies a deeper meaning, a gesture of love, respect, and family. Stay with us until the end to feel the tenderness of this heartfelt story. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The morning light glistens on the soaked earth as Diep loads the last basket of freshly picked corn onto a small cart. The rain has stopped for now, but puddles still shimmer across the path, reflecting the overcast sky. She wipes her forehead, glancing back at little Nye, who is sitting on a wooden stool beside the cart, swinging her legs with quiet excitement. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" Diep asks softly, tucking a strand of damp hair behind her ear. Nye beams. "We're going to Grandma Huyen's, right?" Diep nods, smiling at the girl's bright energy. "Yes, and you'll get to help me give her a surprise." The road to Mrs. Huyen's house winds through muddy fields and flooded patches, each step leaving a faint squelch beneath their worn sandals. The scent of wet grass and corn stalks lingers in the air. Diep's hands tighten around the cart handle, the wheel splashing through shallow puddles as she moves forward. Beside her, Nye hums a tune softly, her little boots kicking droplets into the air. "Hold on, Nye. The road's slippery," Diep warns. "I'm fine," Nye giggles, her laughter carrying through the damp morning air. For a moment, everything feels simple. Just a woman and a child, walking side by side, bound by love and quiet resilience. After nearly an hour, the outline of Mrs. Huyen's gate comes into view. A sturdy wooden gate, half covered in vines, its paint faded by years of rain and sun. The sight stirs something warm in Diep's chest. She remembers the first time she came here, nervous, holding Nye's hand tightly, uncertain of her place in James's family. But today feels different. Today, she comes not as a guest or stranger, but as someone who belongs. "Grandma!" Nye calls as soon as they reach the gate. The old woman's voice answers from inside, cheerful and firm. "Nye, is that you?" The gate creaks open, revealing Mrs. Huyen, her face lighting up in delight. Her simple gray hair is neatly tied back, and her hands, still flour-dusted from kneading dough, reach out warmly. "Oh my goodness, you two came through this weather. Come in before you catch a cold." Nye rushes forward to hug her grandmother's waist, giggling, while Diep bows politely. "It's been a while, Mom. We brought some corn from the farm. The rain ruined a few crops, but these are still good." Mrs. Huyen smiles, eyes glimmering with affection. "You never come empty-handed. Let me take some." No, I'll carry them in," Diep insists, pushing the cart carefully through the small courtyard. Inside the house, the familiar warmth greets them. The faint aroma of herbal tea and old wood mingling with the sound of boiling soup. Diep sets the corn down beside the table, her heart quietly full. Mrs. Huyen glances at the muddy basket, chuckling. "You didn't need to bring so much. I've missed your visits more than the corn." Diep wipes her hands with a towel, smiling shyly. I wanted to bring something special this time. She reaches into her bag and carefully takes out a box. Elegant, wrapped neatly with a cream-colored ribbon. "Mom," Diep says softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is for you. Please accept it." Mrs. Huyen blinks, surprised. "Oh, Diep, what is this?" "Just something I wanted you to have," Diep replies, gently placing the box into her hands. Curiosity gleams in the older woman's eyes as she unties the ribbon and lifts the lid. Inside lies a Louis Vuitton handbag, its leather shimmering under the soft kitchen light, the monogram glowing faintly like a symbol of love and gratitude. For a moment, silence fills the room. Mrs. Huyen's eyes widen in disbelief. "Diep, it must cost a fortune." Diep shakes her head lightly. "It's around $20,000, but please don't think about the price. It's not about that. You've done so much for Nye and me. You welcomed us when you didn't have to. I just wanted to give you something meaningful, something that shows how grateful I am." The older woman presses a trembling hand to her chest, emotion softening her voice. "You silly girl. You didn't need to do this. Just seeing you and Nye happy is more than enough for me." Nye tugs gently on her grandmother's sleeve, eyes wide with excitement. "Grandma, it's so pretty. You can use it when you go to town." Mrs. Huyen laughs, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "Oh, this child. You always know how to make me smile." Diep exhales quietly, a small wave of relief washing over her. She had worried that the gesture might seem too much, but the warmth in Mrs. Huyen's eyes tells her it was the right choice. They sit together at the table, sipping tea as the rain outside begins again, soft and rhythmic. The faint glow of the oil lamp paints their faces in gold and amber. "You know," Mrs. Huyen begins gently, "James has been so busy lately, but he talks about you both often. He worries about the farm, about you working too hard." Diep nods, lowering her eyes. "The flood hit us harder this time, but we'll manage. I just didn't want him to worry too much. He already has enough on his plate." Mrs. Huyen reaches over, resting her wrinkled hand atop Diep's. "He worries because he loves you. Don't hide your struggles from him. You two are building a life together. Sharing your burdens is part of that." Diep's lips press into a faint smile. "You sound just like him." "Of course," Mrs. Huyen laughs softly. "He gets that from me." The three share a quiet laugh, the room filled with warmth that no storm could wash away. After dinner, as they sit by the window, watching the rain glisten under the garden light, Nee falls asleep on her grandmother's lap, clutching a half-eaten ear of corn. Diep gazes at them, heart swelling with tenderness. She whispers, "Mom, I'm really grateful for everything, for treating Nye like your own." Mrs. Huyen strokes the child's hair gently. "Nye is family. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does, and you've given her plenty of that." Diep's eyes mist over, her chest tightening with emotion. "I'll keep working hard. For her, for all of us. Just promise me," Mrs. Huyen says, her voice low and sincere. "No matter how hard things get, don't lose that kindness. That's your real wealth, Diep." The rain outside seems to echo her words, steady and unending, a lullaby of resilience and grace. As the night deepens, the house glows faintly through the storm. Inside, 3 generations share a simple warmth: tea, laughter, and love that needs no grand gesture to be felt. But for Diep, that Louis Vuitton bag wasn't luxury. It was a message from the heart, a symbol of gratitude too deep for words. In that small, quiet home, surrounded by the sound of rain, Diep feels a peace she hasn't known for months. The rain had finally eased by the time the clock struck 9. Outside, the muddy yard shimmered under a faint moonlight. The air smelled of damp soil and corn husks, while the sound of frogs croaking rose faintly from the ditches beyond the fence. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Nee was asleep in the bedroom, her tiny hand still clutching a piece of corn like a trophy from the evening feast. Diep sat by the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. The faint steam curled into the air as her thoughts wandered. It had been a long day, hard but fulfilling. The soft glow of the oil lamp reflected in her eyes, carrying both weariness and contentment. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy, familiar. The door opened, and there he was, James, drenched from head to toe, hair slick with rain, his face showing both surprise and relief at the sight before him. "Diep," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. She stood quickly, worry crossing her features. "You're soaked. The roads must have been terrible." James set his umbrella against the wall and smiled tiredly. "Yeah, the bridge almost flooded, but I'm home now." He looked around the cozy kitchen, the scent of corn, the flickering lamp, and his mother sitting contentedly on the couch, stroking Nai's hair. "Smells like home," he murmured. Mrs. Huyen smiled. "Your wife cooked dinner, and it was delicious. You missed quite a meal, son." James's eyes softened as he turned to Diep. "I bet you didn't even rest all day, did you?" Diep laughed quietly, handing him a towel. "You know me too well." As James dried his hair, his eyes landed on something unfamiliar resting on the table. The Louis Vuitton handbag. The luxury logo gleamed softly under the lamplight, looking entirely out of place among the humble ceramic bowls and bamboo baskets. He frowned slightly. "Mom, where did you get that?" he asked, puzzled. Mrs. Huyen's lips curved into a teasing smile. "Ask your wife." Diep froze for a second, then chuckled nervously. "Ah, that's what I gave Mom today." James blinked. "You bought this?" Diep nodded gently, her expression earnest. "Yes, it's a gift for her. She's done so much for us, James. She's helped with meals, with everything. I wanted to give her something meaningful." James's brows knit together. "But Diep, this is a Louis Vuitton bag. It must have cost, what, $20,000? "Exactly," Mrs. Huyen interrupted with mock seriousness. "I tried to refuse, but she insisted, said it's a gift of gratitude." James turned back to Diep, his voice soft but tinged with concern. "Diep, that's a lot of money. You didn't have to—" Before he could finish, she gently placed her hand on his. "I know, but I wanted to. I used the savings from the furniture shop's profit and a small bonus I got from the market. It wasn't impulsive, James. It was my way of saying thank you to the woman who raised the man I love and opened her home to me and Nye. Her words hung in the air, warm and steady. James's shoulders relaxed as he looked into her eyes. There was no extravagance in her tone, only sincerity. You, he sighed softly, you always think of everyone else first. Mrs. Huyen chuckled, breaking the quiet tension. Don't scold her, James. This bag may be fancy, but what matters isn't the price, it's her heart. She glanced at Diep with pride. You've done something rare, my dear. Not many people today give gifts out of pure gratitude. James sat down beside Diep, taking her hand gently. You didn't have to prove anything, Diep. You've already given us more than enough. Your kindness, your patience, your love for Nye. Diep smiled faintly, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. Maybe I just wanted to remind us all that gratitude doesn't have to wait until life gets easier. I wanted to give something while I still can. For a moment, silence wrapped around them. Outside, the rain had turned into a light drizzle, soft against the roof tiles. Mrs. Huyen looked at the couple, her eyes moist. You two make me proud, she whispered. Not because of the gift, but because you love each other with such sincerity. That's worth more than any bag in the world. James turned to his mother with a gentle smile. You're right. But still, maybe you should save that bag for special occasions. Mrs. Huyen laughed heartily. Oh, don't worry. I'm planning to carry it to the market tomorrow. They all burst out laughing. Even little Nye stirred from her sleep in the other room, murmuring something about corn cakes before turning over again. The mood softened. Diep leaned her head against James's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with her. You know, she murmured, for the first time in a long while, I feel like things are falling into place. The farm's surviving, Knee's healthy, and we're all together. James kissed the top of her head softly. That's all I ever wanted. He looked around the humble kitchen, the faded curtains, the steaming teapot, his mother humming softly by the stove, and realized something profound. Happiness wasn't about wealth or possessions. It was moments like this, quiet, imperfect, yet complete. Later that night, after Mrs. Huyen went to bed and Knee was tucked in, James and Diep sat outside on the porch. The air was cool, the rain having washed away the dust of the day. Fireflies blinked across the garden, tiny stars in the darkness. James turned to her, his tone gentle but serious. Diep, you've done something beautiful today, but promise me something. She tilted her head. What is it? No matter how much we earn or how far we go, don't lose that heart of yours. The one that finds joy in giving, in caring. That's what makes you who you are. Diep smiled, eyes glimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. I promise. And you, don't forget to come home early once in a while. James laughed softly. Deal. The night deepened, filled with the quiet hum of crickets. Above them, the clouds drifted apart, revealing a faint sliver of moonlight that fell across their faces, gentle, peaceful, unbroken. Inside the house, the Louis Vuitton bag rested neatly on the shelf beside an old teapot, its gold monogram catching the faint glow of the oil lamp. It looked almost out of place among the simple things, but somehow it belonged. Because it wasn't just a luxury item, it was a story of gratitude, love, and the unspoken bond between 3 generations who had weathered storms together. That night, as the house settled into quiet sleep, Diep closed her eyes with a full heart. She had once feared being an outsider, but now she knew she was home. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream, not of wealth or comfort, but of mornings filled with laughter, evenings filled with peace, and a life built on love that no storm could wash away.